There is a seductive lie that undergirds most human approaches to meaning, a lie that speaks in the idiom of certainty, of grounding, of an epistemological foundation that can be built upon like bedrock. This presumed stability, often termed the given, is the imagined wellspring from which thought, language, and significance supposedly emerge. Yet upon closer examination, what presents itself as a source is revealed to be an abyss. Not a font of meaning, but a laceration that cannot clot a wound at the heart of being that hemorrhages endlessly. Not as accident, but as essence, to understand. Meaning in this context is not to decode a message delivered by a benevolent universe, but to sift through the charred residue of a divine evacuation. The origin, far from being a firm ontological anchor, is a site of self-abandonment to being or principle incapable of sustaining itself, convulsively emptying itself out in a gesture that mimics generosity, but reveals itself as pure auto-dissolution. Giving, then, is not a transfer, but an evacuation. The gift is not an offering, but a contagion, and to receive it is not to gain, but to inherit loss. This leads to a perverse inversion of traditional, metaphysical, and phenomenological assumptions. Instead of subjects encountering an external world, laden with significance, we find ourselves as the refuse heaps of a self-destructive origin, momentary coagulations within a larger hemorrhaging system that neither knows nor cares for coherence. The subject becomes the unfortunate vessel into which the disintegrating origin pours its final breath. Not a recipient of light, but a site of dark sedimentation. What remains is not meaning, but the phantasmal trace of its absence, a stain, where substance once threatened to be. Within such a framework, the very act of meaning-making is contaminated from inception. The effort to interpret, to symbolize, to extract coherence from chaos, is always already complicit in the pathology of the source. This is not the romantic alienation of the existentialist, where meaning is absent but possible. It is not the melancholy of the postmodernist, who mourns lost meta-narratives. It is a far deeper, structural betrayal. The impossibility of meaning born not from human limitation, but from the very nature of what purports to offer meaning. The problem is not that the subject cannot find the origin, it is that the origin has annihilated itself in the act of giving, and so the foundation upon which we attempt to build collapses beneath us, not like a house of cards falling, but like the ground dissolving beneath a man walking across a landscape that was never truly solid. The metaphor of the sinkhole is apt, but insufficient. This is not a localized collapse, but a systemic one. The entirety of the structure, ontological, epistemological, spiritual, was constructed atop a void masquerading as substance, and the closer one moves toward the center, the more rapidly the unraveling occurs, like circling a spiritual black hole from which no meaning can escape. What becomes of the human subject under such conditions? It is not a heroic figure, carving significance out of a chaotic world through will and intellect. Nor is it a passive recipient of divine or natural gifts. Rather, the subject becomes an accidental byproduct of a process it cannot control, cannot comprehend, and cannot halt a leaking receptacle into which the origin bleeds, not messages, but the poisonous effluvia of its own destruction. Identity, in such a model, is no more than a brief eddy in a current of dissolution of form without substance, momentarily visible before it is pulled back into the void. Here the idea of will is not simply undermined, but annihilated before it can take root. The subject does not choose to interpret or to signify. Instead, it is already infected by a discourse that precludes volition. The origin's gift of evacuation of itself strips the subject of autonomy at the root. What appears to be freedom is merely a ripple in the current of the origin's collapse. Action becomes mimicry, intention becomes farce, and the self becomes a puppet, animated by the spasms of a dying god. Yet, if the origin is defined by its own refusal to be origined, by a pathological need to unbeathen every symbol, every interpretation, every attempt to stitch together a narrative from the given, becomes a recursive act of participating in this self-cancellation. Meaning, thus conceived, is not a structure built atop a foundation, but a bleeding wound that can never heal. Each symbol is a coagulation that crumbles upon contact. Every system of thought is a mirage, conjured from absence, destined to dissipate. Before it can stabilize, what then are we to make of the act of understanding itself? It becomes a tragic enterprise, not because it fails, but because its very success reveals its own futility. To understand the nature of meaning in this schema is to recognize the impossibility of meaning. To receive the gift is to be hollowed out by it. To think is to hemorrhage. There is an eerie, almost theological horror in this picture. Negative metaphysics, in which the divine is defined not by plenitude, but by its relentless self-emptying. Unlike the kenosis of Christian mysticism, where God voluntarily empties himself in love, here the evacuation is compulsive, devoid of benevolence, a convulsion rather than a sacrifice. The source does not give out of fullness, but because it cannot bear its own presence. The divine, if it exists, is not a being, but a wound, a hemorrhaging absence that leaves in its wake a world built on echoes and shadows. This casts human life in a deeply tragic register. The subject is not simply exiled from meaning, but constituted by that exile. Not merely lost, but born from loss. Not alienated from a once stable foundation, but the residual foam atop an ocean of annihilation. The pursuit of meaning becomes less an act of construction, and more a ritual of mourning. We are not philosophers interpreting signs. We are custodians of a crypt where the corpse of the given has long since disintegrated, leaving behind only the unbearable stench of nothingness. And yet, it is within this very collapse that the final, paradoxical insight emerges. If meaning is always a trace, a residue of the origins vanishing, then the act of interpreting meaning is not a futile grasping at illusions, but a participation in the very dynamic that defines existence. To think, to interpret, to symbolize, these are not gestures of transcendence, but of fidelity to the structure of the real. We are doomed, yes, but our doom is also our essence. To be human is to be a leak in the cosmos, a wound through which the original hemorrhage continues. In this light, even our suffering gains a strange kind of dignity, not because it is redemptive or purposeful, but because it is true to the nature of things. The despair of the human subject, the constant craving for coherence, the aching sense of loss, the failure to grasp the stable meanings, not a deviation, but a reflection of the origin's own self. The horror we feel in the face of the void is the echo of the origin's own horror at being itself. Ultimately, this vision requires a radical rethinking of all our categories: origin, meaning, self, gift, will. Each of these becomes inverted, hollowed out, and contaminated. The origin is not a beginning, but an end in motion. Meaning is not presence, but decay. The self is not a unity, but a clot of contradiction. The gift is not generosity, but compulsion. Will is not agency, but a phantom effect of a deeper annihilation. To live within such a system is to live as a site of continual hemorrhage to carry within oneself the fatal logic of the origins of erasure. And yet it is precisely in this condition that a new kind of lucidity emerges. Not the light of enlightenment, but the harsh illumination of a wound that cannot be ignored. In place of the comforting stories of purpose, we are offered the cold truth of bleeding. But perhaps, in facing this truth without flinching, we become something more than the abandoned containers of loss. Perhaps we become witnesses not to a grand narrative, but to the dissolution of narrative itself. not to a presence, but to the vanishing trace of what once pretended to be one. Here, at last, the human condition reveals itself, not as a tragedy awaiting redemption, but as the inescapable performance of a cosmic breakdown, beautiful, horrifying, dance on the edge of the abyss, where to speak is to bleed, and to understand is to vanish.
To read the raw excerpt discussed in this video, along with a more detailed analysis, please visit our Substack page at https://substack.com/@AETHYRICPHRONTISTERY. Link in bio.